Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back. This is the extended cut version of my Great Guitar Build Off build. Most of you have already seen the normal version. It was already pretty long. We packed a lot of material in there. I had to speed a ton of stuff up. I had to cut a bunch of stuff out. And yeah, I still tried to throw as much information in as I could, but there's a lot more. So in this video, we've done the same thing. There's a lot of the same footage, but slower, more explanation. This video is long. So we're gonna get right into it here. If you haven't seen the first one, check it out. If you haven't seen the demo of the guitar, check it out. Yeah, it turned out really great. It sounds awesome, feels good to play. So let's take a look at how I built it. Full disclosure, I edited this version together first, and then I cut it down to the other video and redid my voiceover. So if there's anything at the end that makes it clear that that's the case, yeah, that's the case. I didn't think you guys would want to watch what at that point was a 90-minute video as my entry. But for those who are interested, here it is. Enjoy. Alright, let's jump into some of that explaining I promised you guys. You want to hear a guy talk for an hour and a half? Here we go. We'll discuss the design of this thing a little bit more later, but for now, when you're cutting something like this with a jigsaw, which of course isn't the preferred method, a couple things you need to keep in mind. One, you need a fairly powerful jigsaw. So I've got a larger model here, high amperage, that can get this job done. And two, you're going to need a long blade. So there are a couple different lengths. Make sure that you're getting one that's going to go all the way through. You're not going to be able to saw this thing unless you've got a long enough blade to get all the way through it. Now, you also need to be careful if you're doing it on a sawhorse or whatever it is that you're cutting on. that you don't run into that item underneath it when you're cutting. So keep in mind you can only cut off the edge like I'm doing now. You're going to have to move your piece around a few times and clamp it. Just go slow, be careful. These things can maneuver corners actually reasonably well, but you don't want to force them to do that too much if you can avoid it. So make sure you're doing a few relief cuts. You'll have seen me kind of cut up to the line a few times and then pull the saw back out and come at it again from another angle. You want to have a couple cuts to prevent yourself from having to try to follow this line all the way around or anything crazy like that. It's not a scroll saw, it's a jigsaw, so give it a chance to make those corners by putting in your relief cuts. Now let's talk about the design of this thing for a minute, because I've had a couple people ask me about that top horn, for lack of a better way of describing it. I mean, it's a single cut, but it's got that top section that kind of comes up, and a few people asked me if that would be comfortable. I think yes, and now I've tried it, and it is. So what you need to worry about here is this curve I'm cutting right now, that's the belly carve area. That part needs to be deep enough to be comfortable. Otherwise it's going to feel like you're playing an acoustic, which some people find comfortable. I do not. The top horn there, and let me be clear, it's because I'm bad at acoustic, but that top horn there can extend as far as it needs to. Really, it could go on for another 2 feet and it wouldn't really matter as long as you've got hand access on the other side. The top horn, as long as there's a carve there for your stomach and rib cage to go into, it doesn't really matter if it's pointy or what direction it's facing or anything like that. So there are some pretty aggressive guitar designs out there that have that kind of going off on a weird angle and it's sharp and all of that, and they're comfortable to play. I've tried a couple of them because that section doesn't really matter. What matters is that part that you see me cutting now, which if you can't tell is the hand cutaway. As long as you've got a nice hand cutaway for access, it's going to be a comfortable and playable design. And this design, although it is kind of my own, also looks a lot like a couple of other options out there. So it's got some inspiration from obviously the Telly because it's a single cut, the BC Rich models because it's got a little bit more aggressive shape to it. And someone mentioned this recently, and I realized after I'd already cut it out that it also bears a strong resemblance to a single cut model made by Barlow Guitars. Check them out on Instagram if you haven't seen them. They've got a single cut that actually looks quite a bit like this, especially up at the top. So here we can see kind of the basic outline, and I'm going to clean this up with the router. That's the next step. So first off, when you're cutting out a guitar, if you haven't seen someone do this before, ideally you use a bandsaw to get this part done. You get as close to the line as possible to make things easier for yourself when you go to move on to your router. And then you're going to want to use a template generally, unless you want to spend a lot of time filing, sanding, rasping, that kind of stuff. You're going to want to use a template to let your router clean up that edge for you. So I'm using the super glue and masking tape trick, although the guys over at Wonder Bread Guitars claim to have a better option, so I'm going to have to check that out because it looks like a really nice double-sided tape that will save some time and effort here. This method works really well. I, like most people, got it from Ben at Crimson Guitars, but it is a bit time-consuming and you have to line everything up, and you know, if you're not careful, you're going to glue your template right to the top of your guitars. So I'm looking forward to trying the other option that the boys over at Texas Toast have pointed out. If you haven't been following the series here, following the Great Guitar Build-Off, I'm going to interchangeably call them Texas Toast Guitars, which is their actual name, and Wonder Bread Guitars, which should be their actual name, # Wonder Bread Guitars. Most of you will have laughed at that. The rest will think I'm insane. Anyway, so I get this template secured in place, and I'm going to be using a long double bearing router bit for this that is specifically designed for doing guitar work. Actually, it's made by Radian Tools. You can check them out. They've also sent me a surfacing bit. Great tools. I've shown them a couple times now, but this I think is the first time on my channel that I've shown actually doing a full guitar body like this. Yeah, it would be the first time where I'm taking out the shape. So this bearing is basically the width of a guitar, or the length that you would expect from the width of a guitar, and it's got a bearing in the top and in the bottom. So you can follow a template on either side. great option for those of us who can't afford a pin router like Matt. I've got my DeWalt router here. This thing comes with a 1/2 inch chuck and a 1/4 inch, which is perfect because I need the big chuck for this guy and I need the 1/4 inch chuck for a lot of my other bits. And it's got the horsepower I need to get things done. Very quick adjustments with this guy too, and it's got a plunge thing. If you're looking for this or basically any of the tools that I use, you can find them either in the Amazon link in the description below this video or in the solo guitars, the solo music gear link down there. Those are the two places where I get most of my stuff, and those are affiliate links, so if you use them, it helps me out. So I'm doing my routing here, following the template, checking occasionally to make sure that my bit hasn't changed locations, make sure that my bearing is going to follow this template properly. When you're doing this, make sure you are going the right direction, okay? If you don't know what direction to push your router, you're going to have a bad time. So keep that in mind. You want to follow your shape in the opposite direction of the way that your bit is spinning. So do that or your bit's going to jump and you're not going to have much fun out there. This is actually a very easy way of doing this. You can also set this up in a router table. And like I said, if you've got a pin router, well, what the heck are you watching me for? You already know what you're doing, I assume, or you've got way too much money. Now I'm taking my trim router. This is my little guy from DeWalt. I use this one for anything where I want to be able to kind of control it one-handed like this. And God, I love this thing. This router has done a lot for me. I'm using an angle bit here. It's a 90 degree, and I'm putting my bevels in, my preliminary bevels in some areas and my final bevels in others. But I've marked out all those bevels when I was doing the design work right at the beginning, and this is a fast and easy way to get them in place, and then you can work with a file or whatever you need to finish them off after. So I'm just putting them in part way right now. I've got the bit adjusted fairly high, so I'm just getting them laid out, and then I'm going to go in and deepen them after as necessary by adjusting that bit downward. And that's not just because I want to see them first. That's because it's easier on the router, it's easier on the bit, less chance of tearaway. There are many reasons to do it this way. With a router, you don't want to try and take off too much at once. That's the general rule. Work slowly, work in steps, and be careful. They are dangerous tools. Just like Matt and other guy. Kidding. I don't think they'll watch this anyway. So I'm getting the rest of those laid in there. I do have some areas that I'm going to round over instead, some areas that I don't want beveled. So I got to be careful about that. But with this router, that's pretty easy. Again, this guy's available in the Amazon link. I go in and do a quick adjustment here because I know I want to deepen some of those bevels. I've even beveled out that bottom section that's got the big one marked out, and you'll see how I end up doing that. It's with another great tool that you've probably seen me use before if you follow this channel. Also available on Amazon, the saber tooth grinding disc, but we'll deal with that later. This belly carve, you'll see me kind of do it part way here, and then I end up coming in later and deepening this out quite a bit, but that's much later in the process when I realize it's just going to be more comfortable to have that further in. I started doing my belly carves a little bit deeper. It may or may not be because COVID's gotten me fatter, but I think I'm going to keep them that way because it takes a little bit of weight off the guitar. It's nice and comfortable, and I think it kind of looks cool. There's really no reason to have more wood in that area. It doesn't accomplish anything. So that's what I've been doing recently and what I'll probably continue to do. So here's your first look at some of those bevels. There will be more. They do get changed a little bit, especially that guy in the bottom. But yeah, this thing is starting to come along here. If you've been watching my stuff and if you've been following me on Instagram, you know that those other areas drawn out are for pick guards on the front. Those are going to be at 2 different levels. We'll cover those when we get to them. Now I'm cutting out the headstock. I've got this this thing neck clamped down very carefully. This part was a little nerve-wracking because it kind of rattles around a little bit, and I didn't want to compress it too much because it's got frets, and obviously I don't want to flatten those out and screw them up and have to do them again. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but for now, here's what we've got. Neck's clamped down, and I'm just cutting it out quickly with my jigsaw. The jigsaw is a perfectly adequate tool for this, but again, a bandsaw would be better. Now I'm doing some sanding. I've got this massive belt sander at the shop. You don't need one this big, and I ended up doing part of the sanding with a smaller one that I now have at home. You guys, if you've been watching, have seen me unpack that. It's my rigid model. There's also a widen model that's very similar through that Amazon link, but those are great sanders. This guy is not something that you're going to buy for your house. The other one you would, but this one is a big industrial unit. Gets the job done quick, which is what I wanted here. Nice and quick, nice and smooth. With a sander this big, you can put a higher grit belt on it and kind of get a smoother finish while still getting it done fast. This is the smaller unit that I was talking about. It's got the oscillating sander here, and you can also change it out to a spindle sander very easily. And this is what I use to get into the rest of those curves for this rough sanding portion. And then I go in and do the rest with a palm sander and by hand and finish it off. But for the big work on the curves, belt sander like this is the way to go. Gets things done fast, easy to control. You got a nice flat surface to work on to make sure everything's square. This sander design is particularly helpful because it can get into all those curves, and with the spindle option as well, it can get into the smaller areas where you've got the cutaways and everything else like that, no problem. Now that final shaping work is done for the outline, I'm working again with my router to go back in and fix up those bevels, deepen them out, make sure that they're following the curve of the body properly. And I'm taking this thing a little further this time with the bit. It's a large angle bit, so it gets in there pretty good and puts a pretty significant bevel in what I want it to. You see, this is why I have two routers. If I were using the big one, which you of course need for the high power work, I'd have to clamp it down, the piece and everything, and use two hands. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But this guy, I can just pull out, move the guitar around, hold it down with one hand, and go for it. It allows me some more freedom, a little bit more flexibility with how I'm working, and gets into those small spaces easier. And it's easier to control. You'll see me use it later for some very, very finicky work that I could do with something like this, but I would never want to try with one of the bigger units. So love having this thing. Here I am just putting a little bit of a round over, and again I'm going to end up deepening that out later a little bit, but for now I just wanted to make sure I had the proper stuff laid out in the right places. So I've got a round over there, and I didn't want to take it too far, but yeah, I ended up making it a bigger round over later just because it seemed more comfortable. Here I'm using the Shinto rasp that I got from Solo Music Gear. Again, you can use the link in the description if you want one. Very fast tool. It's a saw rasp, so it's got basically little hacksaws on both sides. One side has the finer ones, one side has the faster ones, but they're both quick, and they get a bevel done pretty fast here. I do end up coming in and deepening this after. I think that's kind of been the story of how I shape this guitar. I do it a little bit at a time, make sure I'm on the right track, and then go in and go further later. The same thing happens for this bevel. So I'm starting with my fast removal tools. Last time it was the Shinto rasp, but this time it is that saber tooth grinding wheel for my grinder. And this footage is in real time. I haven't sped this up at all. You can see how fast this removes material when I'm being careful. If I want to go faster, all I have to do is push a little bit. But anyway, it takes that stuff out of there real quick. So very effective tool for this. Very effective tool for doing an aggressive belly carve. And I've used it for a number of other applications on a few carved guitars that, it can be used for lots of stuff, but you do have to be careful. It doesn't really work with a guard, obviously. It's a dangerous tool, and you can rip away material very quickly. So I do those, and then I come in with my finishing sander here. This is my Dynabraid dual action orbital that I use for this and for finishes, because that's what it's designed for. And this helps me smooth out basically whatever I want. So it works good for these cutaways, perfect for surface sanding, and it's what I used on that belly carve as well. Don't worry as you see me sand off the pencil marks for those pick guards. I've already got the information I need off there to cut them out. If you haven't been following my stuff, I'm cutting them out of metal. Cutting them out of some aluminum, and I'm doing some patterning work on them, and that's how I do a lot of my my pick guards now. I love the effect, and I know a lot of you guys like it too. I've gotten a lot of questions lately about whether I'm going to be selling them. The answer is yes. They're available for custom order right now, or one-off orders if you contact me about them, and I am working on a website. I promise. I just have no idea how to do web design, so it is taking a little longer than I had hoped. Plus, I haven't really had much time to work on it. But anyway, there will be a website where you can pick up metal pick guards. If you haven't seen the ones that I'm using on this guitar yet, they're a nice little accent piece. They really kind of draw your eye. I hope you guys will like the rest of the finish too, but the pick guards are very interesting. So there's going to be a little interesting quirk about how they're set up on this one too. So they're going to look really cool. They are a little bit, they make things a little bit difficult to install in terms of the electronics, but I think it's well worth it. Not difficult per se, just a little bit more time consuming to make sure that everything is in there the way that it needs to be, because one of the pickups ends up bridging two separate pick guards. I love how this thing turned out. Anyway, so there I am sanding that belly carve some more and getting kind of all of that, what should have been final shaping work done, although I do deepen things out later. And then we move on to some hand sanding. All of these little bevels and stuff that I put in, you can't really be sanding those with the orbital. You can a little bit, but it's going to have to be done by hand to a degree, and that's what's going to get it nice and smooth and make sure that your angle stays right. I did have to widen out the access hole here for the output jack. No problem. I used the step bit a little bit at the beginning to make sure I was nicely centered, and then I go in with a Forstner bit and finish it off and make sure it's the right width. Now these uncut kits, of course, don't come with the holes for the electronics drilled. Well, they can't. The uncut kits are awesome. They give you a great opportunity to do all this shaping work and everything, but they do require, of course, not just the body shaping, but some consideration to all this other stuff. So don't forget to do this step if you're working with one of these. Drill your access between the two pickup cavities, and then carefully, using a nice long drill bit, drill your access into the control cavity. I did have one viewer who took exception to me drilling in the corner here. This is the easiest place to get proper access into the control cavity, and there's nothing wrong with drilling in the corner. Just don't screw your pickup into it later and you'll be fine. Well, would you look at that? More sanding. I think I spent, well, I don't even want to tabulate the number of hours that I spent sanding this guitar, but it's a necessary step if you are planning on getting into guitar building, kits or otherwise. Be prepared. You're going to do a lot of sanding. I'm back to work with the rasp here because I'm easing that kind of heel area, making it more comfortable, making it so that your hand's going to be able to access it more easily, and the thing's just going to feel better to play. There's plenty of wood there, so no worries, and I don't want my bolts to be inset too far. They end up being inset, well, exactly how much I want them to, just enough so that my nice rainbow ferrules there go in properly and are pretty much flush with the surface or slightly inset. So that's exactly what I want here. I'm using, well, a goofy multi-tool sander because it fits into what I need. I don't want to remove too much thickness from anywhere else. I'm just trying to increase the access in that area and make that more comfortable. This sander is a nice choice for that, but you can of course do this by hand. You can get a lot of the work done with files and rasps. So don't think that you need all of the tools that I'm using in this video. I am using kind of some easy DIY stuff because I don't have a big guitar building shop, but you can certainly get away with even less. It just takes a little bit more work. Now here comes the intricate part. I've cut out my pick guards. There are two pieces to them. This is the bottom one. You can see there's one hole there to mount the pickup, and the rest of it has no holes in it whatsoever. And the reason for that is this guy is not getting screwed into the guitar. It is getting inset right into the surface, mounted flush to the surface of the guitar. This part was complicated, so I've traced it out to make sure that it sits in the same place. I did that with a pencil, and now I'm going in with a razor blade and cutting around it, breaking all those wood fibers or slicing them all, to make sure that I don't have tear out when I do my next step, which is probably the most daunting part of this guitar build for me, and that's routing this out. So I use a combination of my small router, which allows me to do the more finicky work like we talked about, and some carving tools and a razor blade to get this cut out perfectly to the shape that I need and to the right depth, which is a 1/16 of an inch for this particular guard, which is the standard guard thickness generally. And that's what I use for all of my guards made of aluminum. I use 1/16 inch aluminum. So I'm routing this out. Luckily, this router is easy to control and has a light in it so I can see what I'm doing. Getting my face nice and close to it, so I'm wearing my goggles, of course. I got sprayed in the face with a few wood chips while I was working on this, but I managed to get pretty close to the lines with the router. One thing you might want to think about if you're ever doing something quite like this, the sharp corners that I did on the pickguard, the sharp angles, I wanted them. They were part of the aesthetic. I feel like they complement the kind of sharper look of this guitar, but they do make this a lot more difficult. You are not getting a router bit into a sharp corner, so it meant I had to do a lot more of this by hand with small chisels and stuff like that, carving tools and chisels that I got from Solo Music Gear. And luckily, those allowed me to get that part of the job done, but it would have been nice to be able to follow a smoother curve with a router if I didn't need those sharper angles. So if you're doing something like a more standard Telecaster and you want to inset a pickguard, keep that in mind. You can use a more standard shape, something with some more flow to it, some curves, and you'll be able to get this done a little bit easier, especially if you have the control and you've got a nice little router that allows you to do this sort of thing. So there you can see how close I managed to get with the router, and now I'm going in with the hand tools to finish the job, clean up those edges. I didn't have a template or anything to work with for this. That would have been helpful, but I think it would have been more work to create the template than it was worth because, as you can see, I got pretty close, shaving off the last 16th inch or 8th inch or whatever it happens to be with my chisels and my carving tools. Make sure you do cut around the edge with the razor blade first. That really does help, and it's a safer option. Safer for the wood, possibly safer for you as well. So I hack off some of the heavier stuff with that bigger 1/4 inch chisel, and then I come in with this tiny little engraving chisel, also from Solo, and take out what I need from that corner, because I can't do that with the bigger chisel. It simply won't fit. And then I'll finish off after with a combination of razor blade and carving tools and slice off the rest. The carving tools are pretty cool. I think they're from Hosco, but they're also a Solo Music Gear item. That's where I got them from. So I finish this off, and then the aluminum pickguard ends up fitting quite nicely. I will tell you, this step took a long time for me. It's not something that I do often. This kind of work is not out of scope for me, but I have to be very careful because I'm not very used to it, and I haven't developed a faster method of doing it if there is one. I think Ben would probably get this job done considerably faster than I did because he's used to doing inlays in his headstocks and stuff. For me, I'll just say I was clenching a little bit, and I'll leave it to you to decide whether that was my jaw that I was clenching or something else. These carving tools did really help, though, because I could go in using the flat edge, run it underneath to separate the wood, and then come in from the top and just nicely cut that off. And that made things a lot faster and a lot easier. So having the right tools for this sort of thing certainly does help. I suppose you could get this done with the razor blade as well, but you wouldn't really have that flat edge to work with, so it's a lot more challenging and it would be a lot slower. And this job, at least as far as I'm concerned, was challenging enough and slow enough as it was. Ooh, time for the fun part. Let's get some fire going. A lot of you, when you saw that I had done a burn finish, kind of made some jokes about this being my ode, my nod, if you will, to Crimson Guitars. They do some great burnt finishes. Obviously, this is a little bit different. Theirs are kind of torch it more significantly and then brush it back and all of that. For me, this is just a grain accenting technique. So there are a few different ways to accent grain, particularly on ash, because it has such big, wide, beautiful, open grain, a lot like oak, but a better wood for guitar making, certainly, if you ask me. This is my favorite way to accent the grain on ash, and it's not burning it way down or sandblasting it or anything like that. You can certainly do that. There are ways to accent it with dye, of course. You've seen me do it on other materials, but for this one, the fire just gently like this is my favorite way. And it prevents me from having to do a sand back, which normally wouldn't be an issue at all. But because I've got that big inlay on the surface, I didn't want to be removing a bunch of material from the surface with that in there and screwing up the depth of it. This was also much faster. I didn't have to wait for anything to dry. This took very little time. Most of that footage at the beginning was in real time. This was a nice, quick process, and yeah, it did exactly what I needed it to. It accented the grain. Looks fantastic as far as I'm concerned. Really brings out all of those lines, and those will show through a finish nicely. Now it does roughen them up a little, so you will need to sand after, and depending on what kind of finish you're doing, that may be good or bad. Having that grain open up a little bit does have its merits depending on what kind of finish you end up with, or it makes things more complicated if you're going for like a full gloss uniform look. You'll see that I do a finish on this and then change my mind and strip it off literally within a week of the due date. But yeah, it was worth it. I got what I wanted, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. So that's what it looks like with that guard kind of inset. The guard isn't finished yet. There's some work to be done on that as well. But I just love how this turned out. Make sure if you're going to be doing this that you have a hot enough torch. I've tried this with a little propane torch before, and well, one of them just did nothing, and the other one got the job done real quick, like you saw. So here we have the guards with the patterning work on them, and this is kind of what they're going to look like. I end up having to redo it because I stripped the finish off the whole thing, but that was kind of the preliminary look that I was playing with the guards and what I was going to go with initially before I ended up changing everything. You may be wondering what the heck I'm doing taking a rotor to it after that. Well, all I'm doing here is deepening the cavity a little bit. There's a little too much meat there for the hardware that I've chosen, so I wanted to deepen that out a little bit and thin the top slightly so it would, be easier to install the hardware. Also that it would work, actually. The freeway switch that I selected, the shaft on it isn't quite long enough for how that was initially. And there we go, testing out that guard, fits beautifully. I got it glued in place, and now I'm using a very thin tip on some thin black glue from Starbond. You've seen me use Starbond's super glue before. It's the option that I always go for. I have a discount code for them if you're looking for it. I will put it in the description. And I use a little wicking tip, and I just gently fill in the transition between the two there to make sure that it's going to stay in place and not have a big gap that I need to worry about later during the finishing process. Looks good too, because I'm going to be doing initially a little airbrush work around it. As you see here, I'm putting a thin little vignette using my airbrush to create some separation between the two guards and give this thing a nice little outline. It's a nice way to separate it from the top of the guitar a little bit, particularly if you're painting them the same color. Now you'll see round one on the finishing here, I leave this one like this with a clear coat on it, and then the other one, because it's inset, gets the same color as the rest of the guitar and ends up looking really cool. Again, I took all of that off after, so you'll see what I actually ended up finishing it with, but the initial plan was to have this guy be the aluminum color, the raw color, with this vignette around the outside, this little burst effect, even around the pickup, and to have the rest of the guitar be a nice deep red, a brandywine color that I'll show you shortly. Be careful when you're doing this in something like black. It can obscure the finish, the patterning work if you have anything like this. If you're buying a pattern pick guard from me or something, it can obscure the pattern very quickly, so you do have to be very careful about where you put it. Make sure you're not overspray onto the entire guard, because it will haze that up. So careful about your angles and the amount of paint that you're putting out. Now I need to seal this thing, and to do that, my initial finish here was fully automotive grade urethane. So I come in with an automotive grade 2-to-1 clear coat here, just a U-pull, nothing particularly fancy, because it's just basically being used as my sealer, and I'm going to fire it on there and sand it back. You'll see here what just one coat of this does. Really kind of brings out the grain, makes it look beautiful. An oil also does that, of course, and this is the type of finish that a lot of people would just go over this wood with True Oil, or my favorite, the modified tongue oil from Mohawk, or a Crimson Guitars finishing oil. They've got their system with the penetrating oil and then the finishing oil that works wonderfully. I've used it before as well. It's a good option. So a lot of people would come in with that, and that would work quite well. But of course, if you come in with something like this, you get a heavier gloss quicker. You'll see as I go here, I get, first of all, that beautiful accented look. I love that. But also, I'd like to point out that that grain, because I burnt it and because it's ash, is quite deep. So you can really see that finish soaking in there, even though it's a nice thick 2-part urethane. I end up doing 3 coats on the sealer here. I've got this in real time because I like to show the spraying kind of at normal speed for the most part. I used to speed it up and people got mad at me. So here you go. Real-time spraying. This is what it looks like. This is how long it takes me to put a coat on. I wait about 10 minutes between these in the summer. A lot of people ask me about time between coats. This stuff is generally a 10 to 15 minute flash time. So usually you're going to wait 10 to 15 minutes. But I do want to point out that that is a generalization, and if you are using this stuff, you need to look at the technical data sheet. You need to do a little bit of research on what you're using, because it varies. And even within the same product, it varies significantly. It depends on what hardener you're using, whether you're using fast or slow. But even with the same hardener, it depends on how hot a day is, how much of it you're putting on at once. You know, if you put on a really light first coat to make sure you're getting adhesion and to try and avoid any solvent pop, then maybe you want to wait 5 to 7 minutes if it's a warm day. If it's really hot and you're spraying in Florida and at least you've got your humidity controlled but your temperature is crazy, then maybe you don't wait at all. Sometimes it flashes off very quickly, particularly if you're using a faster hardener. So check in with the manufacturer and get a sense of what it is that you're actually supposed to be doing, because if you screw it up, you're going to end up with possibly a number of issues, including white, hazy solvent pop in your clear coat, possibly some running, problems with it not drying properly, even delamination if I'm being a little bit dramatic. You know, things can go wrong. So be careful. These paints are for people who are willing to take a look and learn what it is they're supposed to be doing. They're also for people who are careful about protecting themselves. So get yourself a mask no matter what kind of paint you're using, but particularly for this stuff, it can harden right in your lungs. Get yourself a full face respirator and be careful out there, guys. So I give this 24 hours to dry, and then I come in with my sandpaper and prep it for the next part of the work. And I'm using some 800 grit here, I believe, because the next part of the work is also a clear coat, although it's going to have something mixed into it. Usually if I'm going in with a color, I'll do 600 grit. If it's a metallic, then I do 800 so that I don't have any of the metallic particles settling into the grooves, because if you look really, really carefully, you can kind of see that in the final finish. You can even get away with 1,000. Wouldn't go any finer than that, though. Some people seem to think that they should be sanding with 2,000 to 3,000 grit between coats. Unless you're working with lacquer, you should not be doing that. The next coat of paint just won't be able to stick properly. It needs something to grip onto, and that's why we sand, to make sure that we've got that abraded surface that the next coat can grip, because after 24 hours you're not getting that chemical adhesion anymore that you get between coats during flash time. 10 to 15 minutes is your general flash time like we just talked about, but if you wait longer like this and you let it set, you have to sand it so that the next coat will stick. I did say at the beginning of this series when I did my unboxing that this wasn't going to be a tutorial, didn't I? I guess I lied. Sorry about that, guys. Hopefully you're learning something useful. So I block this whole thing out like this and do my sanding, and I have to do obviously by hand for the bevels and everything like that. And then it's going to be time to move on to my next round of spraying. Of course, I have to clean it first, so I use a wax and grease remover for that. Get it set up back on my spray stand, and then I mix up my next coat of paint. This is where stuff starts to get interesting. So here I'm using a PPG clear coat. Again, this one's a 2-to-1. It's a nicer EnviroBase EC800, much fancier clear coat, let's put it that way. Now, it's going to look very similar to what the other stuff would, but it just flows out a little differently. I've got a slower hardener. It's a better product for this. And I've mixed in the Brandywine Candy Concentrate from House of Color. I'm doing this a little heavier than you normally would if you're doing it over a silver base or something like that, because I don't want to put 100 coats on. I don't want to put 10 coats on. I want to keep it a little lighter if possible. Now, that's going to be a challenge with this wood type, but hey, what can you do? So yeah, this is where things really start to get interesting. These candy colors are a challenge to spray. There aren't a lot of guys out there who do actual candy coating on like a car or something like that, because it's finicky. If you get just a little bit of extra overlap, it shows. You have to be very consistent in your spray technique. Not so bad with a guitar, because it's a smaller surface, so it's a little easier to work with, and not so bad with a grain pattern guitar like this, where I'm not just doing it over a silver ground coat, because I've got all these lines and everything. So let me be clear that I am in no way even remotely qualified to do a candy paint job on a car, for example. But on a guitar for something like this, I've done it before. It looks great, and this one will too. The first coat, don't worry, does go on a little pink, especially over that silver pickguard. If you were doing this just to try and put it over a solid metallic to try and get a deeper red quicker, do it over gold. You put it over gold instead of silver, it's going to look deeper and better faster. But we've got an aluminum pickguard and a wooden guitar. So here's what we're working with. It looks pink at the beginning. It will deepen up. I'm going to do this in 2 sessions because I don't want to load on so much paint that I end up with it running everywhere and not drying properly. As you guys have heard me say in previous videos, if you've been following me for a while, 3 to 4 coats. Do 3 to 4 coats and then let it dry. Give it 24 hours for this sort of paint. Sand it. Make sure it's ready to go for the next coat, and then come back in and go again. I'm using my larger gun for this to get it nice and even for the first one. This is my DeVilbiss FLG 400. It's what I use for all my urethanes. I use a Warwick for my lacquers when I do lacquer jobs. This guy's available in the description as well. It's a nice versatile gun. It doesn't have as wide a fan pattern as some of the like SATA and Iwata guns, which is fine because I'm spraying a guitar. But it flows out the paint nicely, and this unit comes with 3 different nozzle sizes. So it's got one for clear, one for color, and one for primer if you want to do it that way. Whatever works for you. It comes with a 1.1, 1.3, and 1.5. This is coat 2, I think, of this going on, and yeah, here we move on to coat 3. We're really starting to get the red look coming through. You can see I'm wearing that full face respirator, very important, and I'm spraying in front of a paint booth. This paint is no joke. It's a professional product, so I'm not even going to recommend that you use it, but what I am going to say is if you are using it, make sure you're protecting yourself to the best of your ability. I may harp on that a little bit, hopefully not too much. Now you can really see this starting to turn red by this 3rd coat, and again, I'm putting these on nice and even for the first one. I'm going to actually come in with a minigun for my second round here in my next set of coats, and you'll see me start to get a little bit more complicated with it, but not really. I need to come in and make sure that I'm accenting that metal a little better, or I'm deepening the color on that metal because it is silver instead of the slight brown that we've got from the guitar. So it starts out a little pinker than the rest. But I'm also going to deepen this shade of red because this is not just candy red. This is candy brandy, my favorite candy from House of Color, which is one of the premier manufacturers of this type of paint. This stuff is gorgeous. It's a little on the dark side, which I love and think it really kind of accents the look. It complements the look of this guitar body. So those are my first 3 coats. Again, this is done in real time, so you can see what's going on. If you've been really paying attention, you'll notice that these candy coats are going on differently than the sealer coats did because I'm overlapping more. That's an important aspect of painting with candy to get that nice even look. It's not 50% anymore. It's closer to 75 or 90%. Now, I said I was going to try and get a little bit more cinematic with this video, so here is my attempt. I'm in a dark warehouse with one light focused on this thing to try and show you what I'm working with. Let me know if you guys actually like this sort of thing, these more cinematic shots. Oh, look, paint guns. And I may try to incorporate more of them into my work, although it probably makes more sense for me to do that with some music and try and make it actually a little bit more of a cinematic sequence instead of me just talking over it, but here we go. I never claimed to be a filmmaker. Before I go in with my next coat of candy, I've sanded this all back now. This is a day later, and before I move on with that, I want to put a little outline around this pickguard too to separate it from the surface of the guitar a little bit so you can see that there's a transition there, draw some attention to it, and separate it from the other pickguard. So I'll speed this up, but I'm just putting in a quick little airbrushed outline, a little burst around that guard too. And that also helps disguise any aspects of the glue line there, any aspects of the outline of it that may or may not become an issue later, which they don't. I do end up having to do a fair bit of sanding work and coating work to kind of bury that transition between the two, unfortunately, but hey, that's part of the job. Mask up and let's get moving on this candy again. So as promised, I'm coming in with the minigun here and doing the pickguard. I want to get that deepened out a little bit. I've got the fan pattern on this gun turned all the way down, so I'm using a perfectly round spray pattern so that I can carefully aim this and hit what I need. I get the guard done first, and then I'm also going to do a burst around the edge of the guitar, and I'm going to do all of the edges darker. And then we'll come in and darken everything. But I can put this underneath no problem because it's a transparent. So I'm doing my edge work, and you'll see me come in and do a burst on the front and back of the guitar because I want to get, well, yeah, I think you get the idea, a full body burst going. Now, part of why I'm able to do this part way through here is it's a transparent. And that's also why I'm able to do this all in the same color. When I come back over with the same color, it's going to end up being a very subtle effect, this burst look. Keep in mind, and the reason that this works is that the candies always darken. And if you've been paying attention, you will have noticed every time I add some, it darkens. But that is the principle that applies to all of these transparent paints. So I'm working with this dark brandy, but if I were to come in now with, for example, a light, bright yellow over top of this, it would not get lighter. It would not start to transition to that lighter color. It would simply darken, and it would mix like as if you were to mix the paints together. That is not the case with a pigment-based paint. Those ones obviously if you spray an opaque white pigment-based paint on top of a darker paint, it's going to turn it white. That doesn't work for this kind of thing. That's why there's no such thing as a white candy. So keep that in mind if you're working with these transparents at all. They always get darker, which is fine as long as you don't go too dark. As long as you know what you're working with, it makes it easy to get the effect that you want. So I can go in here like I've been doing and put in this burst underneath, and it's going to darken that area. And then when I come back in with the darker paint over top again, it's simply going to push that back and make it a very subtle effect. Now that guard is looking much better, obviously, with some extra coats on there. It takes a few to get that material to deepen up really nicely like that and get that full brandy look. And I come in and do the rest of the burst on the front and back. I'm going to speed this up a little bit so that we don't have to watch me spray all day. So I get the edges done, and that color is really starting to look great. Sorry, I'm stumbling here admiring this. Anyway, once we get this all finished, we're going to come right back in with this gun again and do the front and back. And you'll notice as I do that it's going to be a lot slower. This burst work has to be sprayed pretty quickly because so much paint is flowing through into the same area, and that's because I've got the fan pattern turned all the way down. So I move the gun pretty fast when I do this, but when I go to do the full surface again, I have the fan pattern turned up, the paint's flowing to a larger area, so I really have to slow down, and that's because I'm using a gun that is much smaller. If I had gone back to the bigger DeVilbiss FLG 400 for that, I would be able to get that done a lot quicker, and it would be much easier to make the paint flow out. Now, I didn't want to have to load up and clean two guns with 2K urethane in them to do one job on one day like this, so that's That's down to me not wanting to take that step and knowing that I could get the job done with the small gun if I wanted to. But it would have been easier and faster with the big one. So if you are doing this, consider that. You may want to switch to a bigger gun for that piece. It is obviously a lot easier to get these small bursts going with the small gun, so that's why I've done it that way. So now I've got my fan pattern turned back up, and I'm going in and doing a full coat. Get the edges done first, as I always do, and then I'm going to come in and do the front and back. So let's move to that, so you don't have to watch me spray this for, ages and ages. And here we are doing the back of the guitar. You can see I'm moving a lot slower than I did when I was using the full-size gun. I have the gun closer. The reason for all this is I need the paint to flow out. I need it to get some flow going and be on there wet enough that it's going to level when it sits afterward. I've got a slow reducer in here, so that's good. That's helpful. But it is a warm day, and I want to make sure that my paint's not just going to turn into a massive amount of orange peel because it's going on too light or it's flashing too quickly. For that, we need some flow, and that's why I need to apply more paint by getting a little closer and moving a little slower. Not a problem, just a bit more work, that's all. And a bit more difficult to do than when you're running it with a larger gun and able to move more paint more quickly. The same concept, of course, applies to the front here. We're deepening this color even more as we go, and we're going to have to come over this with a clear coat afterwards. So you're going to see a lot of paint going onto this guitar, but hey, that's part of the deal. Sad that it all has to come off after when I change my mind, but anyway, good experience, hopefully good footage. I hope you guys like this color. I'm going to use this again, this method, on a different guitar at some point here. I just wanted something different for this one, and I'll start talking about that now. Actually, what I wanted, I finished this off. I got this like fully even gloss look, and I just thought to myself, it's kind of a waste of that beautiful ash green. Wanted something a little bit more raw, a little bit more capable of accenting that. You can see the grain and it looks good, but I wanted to be able to almost kind of feel it. I wanted to see it not just through the finish, but in the finish. So you'll see what I ended up doing for that. We'll get to that in a bit. But for now, here's what the color work looks like on this guy. And it's time to move on to the clear coat. I am a big fan of this color. Really, really like it. Nice and deep. I like that I can get the variability when I do the bursts. And I love that grain coming through. I think I kind of went crazy when I took this off, but oh well. Coming in with my final clear coat here, you guys have seen this before. Basically, this is the same paint that I used for the color work, that PPG DC800, and I'm just doing 3 or 4 coats of clear to make sure that everything is sealed in, and when I go to do my sanding and polishing work to finish this guy off, I don't sand into my color, because you want to avoid that. Particularly, well, you always want to avoid that. But in this case with the transparents, if you do that, it's harder to touch up because everywhere you touch up, you get kind of a halo around it where the transparent colors overlap and darken each other. So it's not just a finicky paint to apply, it's also a finicky paint to fix, unlike some of the more basic opaque colors. But we get our 3 coats of that on there. Again, you can see I'm moving a lot faster because I have the bigger gun. I'm moving a lot more paint a lot quicker, and I'm a little further away from the piece. It's just how it goes. That'll also depend on the nozzle size that you're using. I'm using a pretty big nozzle on this one to get the clear coat work done. And there we have it with our 3 coats of clear on. It is looking nice and glossy. Of course, because we've got that deep grain in here, it's going to need some sanding and polishing work. Which of course ends up being a waste because I pull it all off after anyway. It's like I'm foreshadowing for a horror story, but I'm very happy with how the final product turned out after I did all of this. So that's what it looks like pre-sanding and polishing, and then I go in and sand and polish it, and I never even assemble it. I take a look at it when it's all sanded and finished up, and immediately get out the heat gun and rip it off. So we do that. I guess there is no point in me putting in all the footage of me sanding and polishing this thing. You've all seen me do it before. Let's move on to the next step. But just before we do, in case you were wondering, I come in with quick bit of 800 if I need to, but usually 1500, 2000, 3000, and if I really want to avoid having to do much polishing work, I'll come in with a 4 or a 5, either in the 3M Trizact or the Merca Abralon, and then I polish usually with Northern Liquid Ice, followed by the 3M extra fine kind of glazing putty, the swirl remover. You can also, of course, use the full 3M system, and we'll be trying some Jescar polishing compounds pretty soon, and they are on their way. Looking forward to that. Alright, let's move on to the next step. It's time to put my logo on the headstock, but I didn't want to just put it directly on the headstock. That seemed a little bit boring, and if you've been watching my videos on this build, you'll know that I have a walnut cap on the heel of the neck now. So I wanted to complement that and do another walnut piece to accent it. So here we go. We've got a piece of walnut with my name carved into it, laser etched into it, and it's carved to match up with the headstock. And there it is. Include it right on there, and that's the logo. So there we go. We've already got the Angove Guitars logo, the AG, right in the fretboard, courtesy of Crimson Guitars. So instead of just duplicating that, I went with my longer one, the Angove name, using the same A and everything. I know you guys probably haven't seen this one yet because my website's not ready. There it is. Now I'm using Crimson Guitars guitar finishing oil for this because they sent it to me and it seemed appropriate, and it is a great option. As you all probably know, I usually use Mohawk's modified tung oil. The modified stuff is polymerized, so it dries faster than pure tung oil, of course. Doesn't soak in quite as much, gives you a better gloss. Yeah, it's my favorite. But the Crimson Guitars guitar finishing oil is a great option, and they have their penetrating oil if you're doing a slightly more porous wood, but because I'm working on walnut and maple here, there's no need for it. This stuff goes on perfectly well, nice and smooth, looks great, accents the grain, gives us that nice oil hue, that amber tone to it. There's really not much more I need to say about this. It looks good. I end up doing a couple coats of this on the neck, and then on the very face of the headstock, I go back in later with my modified tung oil from Mohawk, just because it's got slightly more of an amber to it. Oh boy, here we go. The crime scene, the tragedy, me ripping off all of the paint that I did before. I know, it looked good, it was nice and level, and some of you will be upset with me for this because some of you like those uniform gloss finishes, and I do too in some cases, but I really wanted to just make what I consider to be better use of this wood. So you can see now there's no burning look on the side or anything because I've sanded off all the paint there. I'm using the heat gun and the scraper to rip the rest of this off. It's a good thing that this was painted within the recent few days or weeks because this ends up going fairly quickly. If I were to come back in a month, this would be a much longer process trying to get all this off. And after a while, if you're using a polyester, for example, after a while the heat gun just really isn't going to do the job most of the time. But there we go. Got all of that off, sanded it smooth, burnt it again, and then had the harrowing task of repatterning my aluminum when it's already inset into the guitar. I don't recommend it. Got it done, didn't do any damage. I was happy and lucky. So pleased with how that turned out, but yeah, scary. Ooh, I talked too long, but look, that's what happens when you try and mix. I did this just for you guys to see, when you try and mix that urethane in water. And here we go, putting it into a solvent. So what I'm doing is a dye finish, basically, but not really, because that candy tint is a concentrate. It's not a dye. It's not meant to be used like this. It's meant to go in a finish. So it's actually got a little bit of bulk to it. It doesn't just dissolve, and it certainly doesn't dissolve in water, as you will have seen. So I've had to mix it into a solvent, of course. I did a little bit of testing here. I tried it in urethane thinner, and it worked. And then I tried it in lacquer thinner, which has a stronger acetone content, and I just liked how it worked in that a little better. Mostly it allowed me just a little bit more time and workability. This stuff is actually quite difficult to apply this way. It's not designed to be used like this. This is me kind of just being me and playing around with finishes in a way that they're maybe not meant to be used, but it's mostly a stain, kind of acting a little bit like a finish here, but because I've thinned it down significantly, it's working quite well. And with the lacquer thinner, it's tough to work because it dries so quickly and it has that kind of finishy quality to it, so it's very difficult to get even. Luckily, I'm working over a burnt finish, and a little bit of unevenness is kind of why I've switched to this. I want some of it to look a little bit more orange, some of it to look a little bit darker brandy. I want more texture. I want more than just an even gloss red finish. Again, I know some of you aren't going to like that, but I'm very happy with how this turned out. I also should absolutely have been wearing gloves, so keep that in mind if you're doing anything like this. Wear gloves. The ones that I had the wrong stuff, and they would have simply melted if I touched this lacquer thinner based product. So I tried to be careful. I got some on my hands. It is bad for me, and I recommend that you try to be careful. This finish, although more user-friendly in terms of not needing professional equipment to apply, is equally difficult, if not more so, to apply to get even because of the way that it goes on. Very interesting to work with this. I had a great time, honestly. And this stuff builds differently than a dye too. So your second coat does something a little more interesting than it would with a dye. The pull-out rate, wow, that's going to sound weird. The pull-off rate when you recoat and some comes off is completely different. There's some of that with the finish as well. So really cool. I enjoyed working with this. You can also mix this stuff right into your oil. That does work into your tung oil, for example, which is what I ended up using here, a modified tung oil on the body. That will go in, but it's even more difficult to apply, and the chances of you getting it even are slim. It's very difficult because it's such a strong tint. So there's my second coat going on. Very, very happy with this color, with how this turned out. I mixed it pretty aggressively to make sure I wouldn't have to do this 20 times. And you can really see that it's not behaving like a normal dye by how much of it stuck to the aluminum, which I now have to take off. Another harrowing experience. Not quite as bad. Well, you know what? Maybe just as bad as carving into the wood, because if I mess this up, I'm taking off stain and I'm going to have to start over. If some of this pulls off the wood, it is going to be a problem. So I'm using a Q-tip here with some lacquer remover and a cloth, well, a paper towel basically, and I'm very, very carefully removing the dye that got onto, I'm going to call it the dye from now on, that got onto the aluminum, because I need that off of there. I have decided that this isn't going to be red like it was in the previous rendition. It is going to be silver. It's going to really draw the eye. It's going to pop. It's going to be a completely different look from the rest of the guitar surface. That is part of why I wanted to change this. I liked it when it was red, but I want both of those guitars to maintain that aluminum look. So this is all sped up at 300% because I spent a hilarious amount of time ever so carefully rubbing off all of this urethane and making sure that this guard was nice and clean right up to the edge. Probably one of the most careful things that I had to do on this build, but I think it was worth it. I really like the pure aluminum look that I ended up with here, in contrast to that nice deep finish that I've got on the rest of the guitar. Not physically deep like the prior one, but a nice deep shade of red. Now it's time to start getting the actual finish on there, and there is a little bit of what I called earlier pull-out, so let's stick with that, of the urethane when I do this. But that's partially because it's got a similar oil base, and partially because I'm using a little bit of 1500 grit sandpaper to make sure everything's nice and smooth. So I'm applying my tung oil, go figure, how typical, my modified polymerized tung oil from Mohawk, one of my favorite finishing products, probably my favorite hand-applied finishing product. Over top of this, seal it all up, get a nice shine, and fill in some of the grain that is now open again, but not all of the grain. I'm going to go over this with another product after, and you'll see how I do that. That's also going to fill in a little bit of the grain, but again, not all of it. I want a little bit of that look left, a little bit of that feel. It feels nice and smooth. You won't actually be able to feel the grain when touching it really, but you can see that little bit of texture, that little bit of interruption in the surface shine that really gives it that extra something, in my opinion. So we've got our first coat of tung oil on here going on now. It's going on relatively heavy so it can soak in, and the instructions on the can say do that, put it on relatively heavy, wait, I think it's 15 minutes, wipe off the excess, wait 24 hours, steel wool, 4-0 steel wool or sandbag to abrade it so the next stuff will stick, of course, and then reapply. And the gloss builds as you go. Keep on going until it's the level of shine that you want. That's how it works. I do it slightly differently than that. I apply kind of a coat, wait a couple minutes, buff off some excess, and apply another coat right away, and then I wait the 24 hours. But that's just how I do it, and you know what? It's not even necessarily how I recommend doing it. I've found that that's what works for me, and I like how it works better, and I think it goes a little faster. But if you follow the recommendations on the can, you're going to have a good time. It's going to go well. You're going to end up with a nice finish, and you're not going to be able to blame me if you screw it up. So there we go. Follow the recommendations on the can. Here's what we've got after our first coat of oil. What do you guys think? I love this. It's got more variability. The color isn't quite as uniform. You'll see there are some areas that are a little bit more orange looking, some that are a deeper red. This is what I wanted. This I am perfectly happy with. And it was at precisely this point, in the midst of panicking about whether I'd be able to actually get this project done, because I pulled the finish off literally a few days before it was due, that I thought to myself, yep, that was worth it. So that was my first coat. Here I am 24 hours after my little process that I said, and I'm going in with the 4-0 steel wool, sanding this back just a little bit, just gently, just to scuff up the oil, trying not to get back into the finish. You see it's kind of matting out nicely and everything, and that's what we want. I'm going to then wipe this off, get it nice and clean, and come in with another coat of the oil. I'll leave that for 24 hours, and then I'm going to move on to the next product. Again, when I'm doing all of this, I'm trying to avoid the aluminum. That's the part about this that makes it very finicky. Nice aspect of this is I don't have to go in and retape everything. I've pulled off the tape in my pickup routes. I pulled off the tape in my neck cavity, and I don't have to worry about that with these hand-applied finishes unless I'm applying them like an absolute lunatic. But no issues there. I just go ahead and scuff this all up, and it's about ready for my next coat of oil. Don't forget to do the back, of course. Let's move on to the next coat. So here we go with the second coat. You'll see, or hopefully you'll see, that it's going on a little bit smoother, if you will, a little glossier. And that's kind of how this works. As you build up more coats, you fill in all the grain and you end up with a smoother surface. You still need to scuff it back, but if you work your way up to like 10 coats, for example, it's just going to be oil right onto a perfectly smooth surface. So that's how you build up a gloss with this stuff, if that's what you're looking to do. That's not quite what I'm going for here. So this is going to be my last coat, and I'm going to apply this just one wet coat like we talked about. I'm going to wait and buff off just a little bit of it, but I'm leaving a little excess because of what I'm doing next. So this coat goes on beautiful, nice and smooth, exactly how I want. And I'm sure I've said this too many times already, but I'm very happy with it. The finicky part here is avoiding the aluminum for the oil as well. It won't stick on there properly anyway, and there's no reason to have it on there, so I'm trying to keep away from that. This is a pretty quick process, luckily, because I didn't leave myself a lot of time to work on this and to finish off this finish. But luckily, like I said, the next day this is going to be ready to go, and I can move on to the next part of what I'm doing. Here's what it looks like with that second coat on. I don't know about you guys, but for the 20th time, I'm pretty happy with how that looks. I like the variability. I like the little bit of grain that I'm getting through in some of the more burnt areas. Yep, I'm doing the Ben style sigh here. I'm happy with that. So next up, we're going to move on to what I've chosen to protect this with and to fill in the grain just a little bit more. kind of going an unusual direction with this one. So once I've got the oil on here, I'm going to apply the next part of my finish with some 4-0 steel wool very gently. The idea isn't to abrade it too much, it's just to make sure it's kind of getting in there a little bit. And the next part of my finish is going to be this paste finishing wax. There are a few different ones available. I like the Blue Label stuff from Mohawk or Bellin, but I really like this Minwax one. There aren't a ton of Minwax products that I'm a big fan of, but this one I am. This is their paste finishing wax, and I apply it reasonable coat here. I'm not too worried about how much goes on at this point. It can be a little bit of excess, and that's not a problem. Again, I'm using some 4-0 steel wool, and this steel wool has been used for this wax for a long time. I've done half the jar with this chunk of steel wool, so it is fully impregnated with that wax, and it's not doing a lot of scuffing. If you're doing a full like scuff job to buff it, you're going to need some newer steel wool probably, or you're going to have to press a lot harder. But that's not what I'm going for here. Again, staying away from the aluminum, getting this whole thing coated in this, and then I'm going in with my heat gun very carefully. I don't want to remove any finish here. I don't want to damage any finish. All I want to do is kind of melt that wax while it's on there. So I'm going to melt it, and that's going to cause it to flow out, level out, look nice and smooth, and fill in some of that grain a little more without completely getting rid of the texture. So I end up with a nice smooth waxy finish here. And then I let this cool and harden, and I buff it with a cloth. You'll see me do that, but I didn't get a great camera angle here, unfortunately. But if you were looking at this up close, you'd see the wax liquefy and kind of flow a little bit into that grain, and that's exactly what I was going for. It looks awesome. Taking this off with the rag now, the little bit of excess that's left over, and kind of buffing it to a nice shine. It's not a full gloss. Again, I didn't think a full gloss would complement this this wood and this finish very well, which is part of why I took off the full gloss work that I did before. So I just buff this out, and we get kind of a nice satin, and you'll see how it turns out. But it only takes one pass with this wax generally. You can do more than one if you want to keep filling in, but you can definitely get it done with the one, and if you apply it reasonably thick at the beginning, it flows out with that heat gun work, and here's what we end up with. This nice satin look, perfectly smooth feeling, but still a little bit of that visible texture, and a super easy to update and repair finish. If you want to add a little bit of wax after the fact, piece of cake, no problem. So I've got to do the rest of the guitar now, get in around the edges, get the back done, and it's all going to have that nice uniform kind of satin sheen to it, almost a semi-gloss. I don't know, maybe it's like a 40 to 45 degree sheen if that's how you do your measurement. I know some people are lacquer enthusiasts and probably follow that system. I gotta say, guys, I am surprised I haven't lost my voice yet. It's I've been talking for like an hour and 10 minutes now, which is ridiculous. Hopefully you're not too sick of me. We are almost there. This is the end of the finish work, and then we are going to get to work on the installation of the electronics and final assembly. And like I said, we're going to do the sound check, the demo, show you guys how this thing plays in the next video, because there is no way I'm making you watch 2 hours of me. I don't like to watch 2 hours of me, and this isn't an Avengers movie, so it's already too long. I apologize, but I thought that what I had included so far was worth seeing. Hopefully you agree. If not, you hopefully already know this, but you can watch these videos on 1.5 times speed or even 2 times speed if you want my voice to sound really high and you want to get through it a little quicker. That option is available to you through the settings right on the YouTube video. I really should have said that at the beginning. Sorry about that. Anyway, hopefully you knew that, or better yet, hopefully you're enjoying watching the video at real time, normal speed. So let's cut the rest of this finishing, because you get the idea, and show you what this thing looks like. Well, there it is. And get a couple gaps in the audio while I pretend to be rendered speechless. Something that nobody will believe after I talked for an hour and 10 minutes straight. And there we are. So next up, we're going to move on to our assembly piece. This is going to be a little bit difficult just based on what I've selected in terms of putting in these pick guards. I had to drill through one of them, of course, to install the bridge. Yeah, we're on to that part now. So getting all my cavities shielded up with my copper foil tape. You can use that. You can use tinfoil and adhesive spray if you want. You can, of course, use shielding paint. Conductive paint is a popular choice and what you find in a lot of factory builds. I think the general consensus and what I believe is that copper shielding tape is the best of them from a quality perspective, but the others work just fine. And of course, we're using humbucker pickups in this guitar, so it really doesn't matter. But once the humbuckers are in and this thing is shielded up with the copper tape and has the aluminum pick guards on it to really kind of complete as close to that Faraday cage as possible, you could probably play this thing right under or in a neon sign if that were physically possible, and you wouldn't get much buzz. So should be good. I'm using a hobby knife to burnish this stuff down, make sure that it's on there nice and nice and firm, nice and tight, if you will, because copper tape's a bit of a pain to lay out, but not too bad. One thing to be mindful of if you are working with this stuff, it is, in essence, a very thin piece of metal. So be careful, because you can cut yourself with it. And a copper tape version of a paper cut is not particularly fun. So try to avoid that. The first time I worked with this stuff, I sliced myself pretty good. That was years ago, but ever since then, I've been, mindful of that possibility and trying to avoid it. And I recommend that you do the same. You can, of course, slice through this stuff with a razor blade pretty easy, so it's easy to do the cavities. Just put it on there and cut around it. Not the cavities, the cavity covers, rather. And then, it's worthwhile to also shield your pickup cavities. So be thorough about this. If you want to really be crazy thorough about it, you can ground your cavities together. You can use a guitar wire or a normal wire for that and just solder it right onto the tape in the different cavities so that the whole thing is connected. That is the most thorough way, but certainly unnecessary if you're using humbuckers. As far as I'm concerned, you can also make sure that the tape connects to itself by using a finishing nail and kind of poking the joints between it so that it folds in on itself a little bit. Okay, it's time to finally get this thing assembled. Let's get the neck in place. We've got our ferrules with the oil slick look, the heat treated look. If you've been watching my stuff, you know that I tried to, just kind of for fun and as a test, flame treat a knob to see if I could get that look on it as well. And it melted. Apparently they are largely made of lead. So don't do that. Just buy the ones that are in the appropriate finish. So there's what we ended up with for that neck joint. There's been a lot of talk about that. I'm very happy with it. These are the pickups I'm putting in, the classic hookers from Crimson. That's all I'm going to say about that. And here's where things get interesting. I had to, and I didn't show you the process here because it's not really a process. It was more fiddling around getting that humbucker for the bridge installed into two different guards at once. The springs caused the the pick guard to sit up a little bit. So I drilled through it, and you'll see in a second here, I put a screw there to hold it in place. I also had to drill through and do my grounding wire space for the bridge, which is no problem. Get my wire installed there and fire this bridge into place. There you can see the screw that I was talking about. I'm trying to speed this up now so this video doesn't end up being too ridiculously long, but you can see the screw that's holding that pick guard in place. It kind of matches the rest of them. I get the ferrules in. For that, you can use a little wood block to kind of blunt your hammer so you don't do any damage, or you can do what I'm doing and use the rubber end of a fret hammer. Get my electronics installed here. So this, I had to, as you know, widen out that output cavity. I'm glad I thought to do that before the finishing, because forgetting that is the type of thing that I would sometimes do. I am slowly starting to lose my voice here, but at the time of me doing this voiceover, I have no time to waste. This video is due shortly, so we're continuing. I have my freeway switch here. This thing has 6 different positions, so it's like an upgrade switch for a Gibson, for example, a 3-way. This one's a freeway. 6 positions, lots of options, and possibly the most complicated wiring scheme I've ever tried. I did actually end up burning myself once. I probably should have tried to wire this up outside of the guitar. I'm using the Super Pots from Dunlop, and here's my wiring scheme, which means practically nothing to me. But hey, we got it done. It's going to work. It looks good. Looks good, sounds good. So got my orange cap capacitor that I'm firing in here between the pots. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this because really I just followed the scheme. I used a nice hot iron. I tin my wires and my lugs when I'm doing this as I go. And that's about it. Make sure when you're doing your cap, you use something metal to hold it and use that on the side that you're soldering so that you don't accidentally burn out your cap. It acts as a heat sink. Make sure you've got a decent soldering iron that's going to be able to heat things properly, especially for the backs of the pots. It's very quick if you've got a good soldering iron. It's a total pain if you don't. So I'm using a Weller analog soldering station, classic. Works really nicely, gets very hot as both my guitar and my hand can tell you, and it gets the job done. Even if you're someone like me who doesn't understand wiring, the soldering aspect of it, not all that difficult. So I'll show you guys what this cavity looks like. I really had some difficulty here finding a camera angle that would give you any detail, unfortunately. But I'm not necessarily the person you should be learning this from anyway. There are lots of good wiring tutorials out there, and I'm not the guy to do them because I'm not particularly good at it. This took me quite a while to get this figured out. We've got 2 pickups here with the 5 wires. Crimson follows the Seymour Duncan color scheme, which I appreciate. It makes things a little bit easier. If you've ever tried to do a guitar with a Seymour Duncan and a DiMarzio, which I'm doing on a different build right now, they use different wiring schemes, and yeah, it makes things interesting, a little harder to keep track of. Some people understand this stuff very well. I'm not one of those people. I go in and tin all of the leads, the many leads on this freeway switch, connect the ones that need to be connected to each other, and then I start soldering in my wires from my pickups and the ones that go directly to the volume knob. And that's about it. That's about all I can tell you about this because I just followed the scheme. I tinned the ends of my wires and I was careful, and that's about it. Didn't burn anything out, which is important. But yeah, you may want to consider doing some of this work kind of raised up out of the guitar if possible. Put these things installed into a piece of cardboard. Might make your life a little easier. There it is. If you can look at that and understand it right away, I applaud you and envy you. Well done. I am the one who made this, and I am still confused by it. But now we move on to, well, back to the things that I do understand. Screwing in strap buttons, very complicated. So I get those in place, and I've got to get, of course, my tuners set up. As you will know if you've been watching, I've selected the Solo Pro locking tuners. I love these things, and they are staggered. So they're this beautiful black nickel, very fond of the finish. You do need to make sure you check the lengths on them beforehand and get them put in the right place because they're specific for that, and that's why I don't need a string tree on this, and I was able to put my kind of design cap there, my Angove thing, right on the headstock. I don't need to put a string tree or roller because these things are different heights, 3 different heights. So you've got the taller ones that go next to the fretboard, and then they get gradually lower. And you can see, if you pay really close attention, I've actually mixed up the 2 lowest sets, and you see me tightening them wrong right now, and then I take a quick look at them and I have to fix them because the 2 in the middle go on the end and vice versa. You yeah, pay attention, get those right the first time, and then you won't have to play around too much. Putting the screws in the back of the tuners is second only to electronics in my least favorite things to do. There's nothing wrong with them, they're very easy, but I hate them. I'm not fond of this step for some reason. When you're doing it, be very careful. Pre-drill, make sure you get a pilot hole. Make sure that pilot hole is tiny. And mark off your drill bit and make sure you don't go too far. Luckily, I've never made that mistake, but it is a possibility. And you do, I'm serious, want to pre-drill your pilot hole there, because if you don't, these tiny little screws can break. And if they break, it is a nightmare. So don't let that happen. Wow, guys, I think that's it. I think we're done. That was almost an hour and a half that you will never get back. So hopefully you enjoyed it. And this is what we're left with. A guitar that I'm very happy with, and I really hope you guys like it. You will hopefully know by now that you need to check out the greatguitarbuildoff.com. That's just greatguitarbuildoff.com. And get out there and donate to the charities that are involved in this thing. Get out there and bid on these guitars. Well, you don't do that there. There will be an eBay link posted in the description. So have a look. And if you are interested in purchasing this guitar, go place your bids. It's all for charity. Mine is the Stollery Children's Hospital, which is a charity that I think is very important and one that I always try to support when I can. So if you want the guitar, bid on it. If you don't think you can outbid someone for the guitar, and if you just want to donate, please do on the Great Guitar Build Off website. Help support the charity, and that actually helps me as well because it counts as votes for me to win this contest. So I hope you guys like this. I hope you enjoyed the competition. That's what it looks like. And you can also vote by following the Great Guitar Build Off Instagram page and liking the post of my guitar. So feel free to do that as well if you want to help me out. But most importantly, if you're able to help support the charities, mine or any of the other ones, please do so. This whole thing was for them, was for charity, and yeah, that's what we're in this one for. So it was fun. I hope we get to do it again next year, and stay tuned for the demo. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like the video and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Have a good one. And sorry again for how long this was.